Did you know that while Roussanne is going out of fashion in its home region of the Northern Rhone, the rest of France is going moggy for it? Plantings of Roussanne have more than doubled since 2008. So they're now 2,000 hectares or more across the whole of France. Because despite being finicky, hard to farm, late ripening, lower yielding, and more susceptible to disease than its sibling cousin of Marsanne, it seems to handle hot vintages a whole lot better than Marsanne does. So it retains more of that natural acidity where Marsanne can go a little flat. And hot vintages, well, that is one thing that France has a buttload of right now. So welcome back to the Hand Drink Solo Wine Info channel, where we review curious wines for curious minds. And today's curious wine is the Mischa Estate Roussanne 2024, which is a wine of origin Wellington. And Wellington is a really rather hot continental inland region in the South African winelands. Perhaps one of the things that makes this wine so curious is the fact that despite being from the very hot region of Wellington, it has managed to stay ridiculously fresh. So what we're going to do up front is get into the glass, and then we'll talk about how it got to be that way. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, up front there is a touch of a slightly more savory note, perhaps some leesy sourdough, although over time that does blow off. But the other things that greet you are really quite fascinating. There's a kind of jasmine-y, lemon blossom type citrus floral note going on. And then that is joined by perhaps some slightly more obvious stone fruit notes and citrus elements. But what's quite interesting to me is how the fruit and the floral mix and create a kind of third category, which feels almost like a kind of peachy sherbet note or a kind of apricot bonbon. Anyway, when we give it a sip, well, man, there is this beautiful, really pronounced, elegant kind of Seville orange, juicy citrus. It's almost tart and really leaves your palate watering. And then mixing in with the citrus elements, there are touches of that kind of almost unripe apricot or white nectarine that we discussed previously. But what's really interesting is how those floral notes we talked about, the jasmine and perhaps the lemon blossom, they don't stay just on the aromas. They totally mingle with the fruit on the palate. And it's almost like you can feel the experience of aroma plus taste creating flavor in your mouth. And so that's where you get that beautiful candied sherbet feel. But if you think about it and break it down a bit, you realize that what you are tasting is those jasmine-y lemon blossom aromas mixing in with the bright, juicy citrus and stone fruit on the palate. And then just as it's coming to a tail, you think everything is closing off. All of a sudden, there is a white grapefruit snap, and it's really quite beautiful, not unlike you might experience on a Chenin Blanc. But then right towards the end, on the tail, you get, again, it's almost like an aroma, a retro olfactory experience of a tinge of green, perhaps like a lemon leaf. And if you've never taken lemon leaves and rubbed them together with your fingers, then you'll have no idea what I'm talking about. But I suggest you do it because it's an amazing aroma. And then I guess I probably in some senses buried the lead a bit, because the texture on this wine, despite being superbly fresh and having loads of that fresh natural acidity, well, it's also got a kind of waxiness to it, which makes it feel a little more formidable, a little more complex. And that waxiness is not too surprising, because it really is one of the characteristics of Roussanne, whether it is made in a big, rich style or a lighter, earlier harvest, lean, fresh style. A question we might have to ask ourselves is, you have a cultivar like Roussanne, which has the potential to be blousy and over fruity, and then you have it planted in a really hot region of Wellington, and you go, well, how did this wine come to be this way? Well, there are three clues that'll help us figure it out. The first clue is the fact that while it does say wine of origin Wellington, it is a little more specific, and the label actually says wine of origin Groenberg in Wellington. And Groenberg is one of the subwards of Wellington, and it's kind of foothillsy, a little bit elevated. These vineyards sit at between 200 and 300 meters above sea level. So not only is it roughly 3 degrees cooler during the day than the floor of the valley, which really is quite hot, but it also has that increased diurnal range, which of course slows down your sugar ripening while your phenolic ripening can then catch up. But when we say that it's in the cooler foothills, I mean, Wellington really is still quite hot. So how on earth do we explain the rest of the freshness? Well, the second clue is the fact that it is a 12.5% white wine, which means that in the context of Wellington, it was harvested really quite early. But here's the thing about early harvest wines. It is easy to pick grapes when the acid is high and potential alcohol is lower, and you produce a green, herbal, sour, astringent, unripe tannin sort of wine. It's not so easy to pick early, produce a 12.5% wine in a region like Wellington, but still have what we smelt and tasted earlier, this dynamic array of jasmine flower and lemon blossom and some tart citrus and apricot fruit all mixing together to produce a really quite dynamic wine. So we can't just say, well, they harvested early and that's why it's fresh, end of story. No, there was very clearly some clever, deliberate viticulture going on that enabled these grapes to ripen slowly enough, but also have enough ripening without suffering from sunburn and a whole bunch of other things to present those dynamic, really quite rounded and developed floral and fruit notes on the palate. The third thing we might want to pay attention to is the fact that this particular Roussanne was tank fermented. So rather than going into barrel and being produced in a rich, spicy style that you might find from the Northern Rhone, this was done purely in tank to preserve all those delicate dynamics that we just spoke about. And Mischa Estate aren't totally committed to tank fermentation. In fact, often their estate Roussanne has gone into barrels, but on the vintages when their fruit and that kind of dynamic interplay between flowers and fruit is amazing, they almost don't want to hide that by tossing it into a slightly oxidative environment like barrels. So they keep it in tank, and what you have here is that incredibly fresh end result. As a kind of parting thought, it's probably worth zooming out just a little bit to see that Roussanne in South Africa is still an absolute minnow. There's about 80 hectares of it across the entire South African winelands. But what is interesting to note is that its potential to handle hot vintages really well is something that may see it become more popular. So I'm going to pour myself one more glass, but as I do that, I'm also leaving links to 2 videos. One will talk about the history of Roussanne in South Africa and some of the first guys to plant it and bottle it. And the other video will talk about Roussanne on a more global scale and touch on its origins in its homeland of France.